Hey guys, hope you guys are having a great day today. I'm guessing you guys are here because you came from my previous two videos, part 1, flattening any sort of array, and part 2, flattening any sort of object, to combine both of what we've learned to flatten any sort of input. If you haven't seen those videos yet, I highly suggest watching those videos, as we're going to be taking what we learned from those videos and applying it to an overall flattened function in JavaScript. I'm going to leave the links for the video somewhere on the screen and also in the description of this video. So if you find this video helpful, please consider pressing the like button below or subscribing. I also do want to mention that I do have a website called frontendlead.com where we're going to have over 75 different front-end engineering interview questions that are generally asked by top tech companies, and 10 plus system design and app design related questions. So if you're currently studying for interviews, check out frontendlead.com. With that, let's get started. For this problem, I've gone ahead and created two example inputs. The first input is a type of object, and the second is a type of array. Because the first input is a type of object, it can contain other objects inside as well as arrays. And the second input is just an array, and it can contain other arrays inside as well as objects. So if we were to flatten out the first input, it would look something like this. And if we were to flatten out the second input, it should look something like this. So let's build this out. So we can start off simple. So let's build a flatten function. So we'll say function flatten input, which could be any sort of type. And what we want to check here is two things, our base cases. The first base case is just to make sure it's not a type of object. So we'll say if type of input is not equal to object, we simply return input. The second base case here is going to be checking if it's a null value, because right here we're checking type of input is not equal to object. However, nulls technically are objects, so we want to also explicitly specify that. So we'll say if input equals to null, then we simply again just return input. Cool. So now we've taken care of that, now we want to check for arrays. So we'll say if array dot is array input, then we can flatten out the array. So we can say return flatten array input. And we'll go ahead and define this in a moment. Otherwise, we can flatten the object. So we'll say return flatten object input. Now when you want to define this flatten array and flatten object functions, let's start off with flatten array. So we'll say function flatten array. And flatten array will take an input again. And in here we want to do 3 different checks. But before we do our checks, we want to define a const called flattened, which is just a list of flattened values, and we can return this at the very end. In here we want to check if array.isArray input, meaning if the input is an array, we can do stuff. Else if input type of input equals to an object and input does not equal to null. Remember, we want to make sure we are explicitly checking for those null values because they are technically type of object. We can do other stuff. Else, now we'll handle all primitive values, including nulls. And yeah, when we're in the else statement, it's pretty straightforward because they're all just primitive values. We can just push them into the flattened list. So we'll say flatten.push, and then we'll just push input. Now, if it's an object, we're going to be defining our flatten object in a second. So we'll say const flat obj flat object equals to flatten object, and we'll just specify our input there. And we simply just push this into our flattened list. So we'll say flattened.push flat object. And now let's handle flattening the input array. So now we'll iterate through our input. So we'll say input.for each item. Now we have each individual item in the input. We want to recursively call our flatten array function, flatten the values out, spread them out, and then push them back into our main flattened list. So we'll say let const result equals to flatten array item. So now that we have the flat values of the item, we can push them into flatten. So we'll say flattened.push result. But remember, result itself is going to be an array. So we want to spread them out so it's on the same level as the initial flat list. Cool. We've taken care of flatten array. Now let's build our flatten object. So we'll call it function flatten object, which takes an object as the argument. And here we're going to define a let called flattened, which is an empty object. And we're going to return this at the end. We want to keep this as a let because flattened is eventually going to be mutated, overwritten. So now what we want to do is we want to iterate through our object. So we'll say for const key in object. Then we grab the value. So we'll say const val equals to object key. Now we want to call our main flatten function here recursively and not the flatten object function. Because remember, the main flatten function will not only flatten objects, but it'll also take care of arrays as well. So we'll say const flat val equals to flatten val. So now that we have the flat value, we want to again check here that as long as the flat value is not an object. So we'll say if not array.is array flat val and type of flat val equals to object, and finally the last and is flat val does not equal to null. As long as all three conditions meet, we know for a fact that this is going to be an object. So because it's going to be an object, now we can overwrite our initial flattened object. So we'll say flattened equals to a new object, and we'll use the spread operator here to extract the values from the flattened initial object because we're going to be calling this recursively. And then we'll also merge this with our new flat value object. So now flattened is going to equal to a combination of flattened before and the flat value as one main object. And that will also help us preserve the key value pairs for flat val itself. Now we can worry about the else statement here. So if it's not an object, meaning if it could be an array, it could be primitives, so forth, we simply reference the key that we've already have here. So we'll say flattened key equals to flat val. And that's pretty much it. We've taken care of flattening objects, we've taken care of flattening arrays, and we're also returning our primitives as we would expect them. So let's try running this. So let's run this on line 12. We already have a console here, flatten input 1. So if I run this, I'm just going to console out line 37. We don't want to confuse ourselves here. Cool. So let's make sure our expected output matches what our output here is. So A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, and then 3 has an object, D 4, and then Z is null, F is 5, and H is undefined, just as expected. And now let's just make sure the flatten arrays are also working as expected. So I'm gonna comment the first input out and comment back in the second input. So I'm gonna clear this out to avoid confusion. So now let's run this. So let's make sure our output matches what we expect. So 1, 2, 3 is flattening the array. The fourth is an object, so it preserves that, but it should have flattened the values inside of the nested array from objects. So that is 789 that matches. Then Z is null, we preserve null values. Finally, our last is going to be an object that contains F, 5, and H undefined, which matches our output here. And we have successfully solved this problem. I hope you guys found the video helpful. If you guys find it helpful, please consider pressing the like button below and subscribing to my channel as I just started off. So every single like and subscribe means a lot to me. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.